Lungs are elastic infoldings of the body surface, sealed within the surrounding chest cavity, that are used to exchange gas between blood and air. Expansion or contraction of the chest cavity, accomplished by motion of the diaphragm, causes a corresponding expansion or contraction of the lungs. This, in turn, produces the inhalation of oxygen and the exhalation of carbon dioxide. The volume of air moved during each breath varies from person to person. During quiet breathing, about 500 milliliters of air moves in and out with each breath. The amount of air inhaled or exhaled during a normal breath is called the tidal volume. The lungs are divided into myriads of tiny sacs called alveoli, or singular, alveolus. The alveoli are surrounded by tiny, extremely thin-walled capillaries into which deoxygenated blood flows. When air enters the respiratory tract and reaches an alveolus, oxygen diffuses across the epithelium of the alveolus and the thin capillary wall into the blood within the capillaries, where it binds to hemoglobin. This process oxygenates the blood that leaves the capillaries. The alveolus functions as an interface between air and blood. That interface consists of a thin layer of epithelial cells, some extracellular fluid, and the wall of a capillary. The capillary wall is so thin that oxygen and carbon dioxide readily cross it. The bloodstream distributes the oxygen from the lungs to the tissues throughout the body. The bloodstream also delivers the carbon dioxide waste from the tissues back to the lungs for expulsion. What happens to the oxygen that enters the blood? Most of the oxygen binds to hemoglobin in red blood cells, although some oxygen is transported in the plasma. The binding of one oxygen molecule to hemoglobin causes a change in the shape of hemoglobin that allows it to bind 3 more oxygen molecules. No more oxygen molecules can bind after that, however, because hemoglobin has exactly 4 subunits, and each subunit can bind only 1 oxygen molecule. When blood encounters tissues at rest, hemoglobin unloads about 30% of the oxygen it carries to the tissues. If tissue activity increases, such as during exercise, hemoglobin releases about 60% of its oxygen to the tissues. What happens to the carbon dioxide that leaves the tissues? Most of it diffuses into the bloodstream, specifically into red blood cells. There, much of the carbon dioxide is rapidly converted to carbonic acid by the enzyme carbonic anhydrase. The carbonic acid then dissociates, releasing a bicarbonate ion and a hydrogen ion, that is, a proton. As a result, the blood pH drops. Changes in pH affect the shape of hemoglobin and thus its ability to bind oxygen. Hemoglobin can bind less oxygen at lower blood pH and more oxygen at higher blood pH. The drop in blood pH leads to the unloading of oxygen by hemoglobin. The protons released by the dissociation of carbonic acid bind to deoxygenated hemoglobin. Hemoglobin thereby acts as a buffer, preventing large swings in blood pH. Thus, the bloodstream can transport carbon dioxide in the form of bicarbonate ions from the tissues to the lungs with a minimal effect on blood pH. When deoxygenated blood reaches the alveolus, the process is reversed. In the lungs, a concentration gradient favors the diffusion of carbon dioxide from the plasma and red blood cells to the alveolus. Bicarbonate is converted back to carbon dioxide, which then diffuses into the alveoli and is exhaled by the lungs. With the next inhalation, oxygen is picked up and the cycle continues.